June 20th marks World Refugee Day, a day dedicated to raising greater awareness about the plight faced by refugees worldwide and to reminding the international community about the need for broader solidarity to better address the issue. That being said, on Issues and Insiders today, we explore the causes, consequences and countermeasures regarding the refugee crisis. Hello and welcome. You're watching Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. In light of World Refugee Day today, I have a panel of scholars to touch upon the current reality facing refugees worldwide and more. For this here in Seoul, I have Professor Cho Hee-kyung at Hongik University live on the line. Professor Cho, it's been a while and it's great to have you back.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I also have Professor Marjoleine Zieck at the University of Amsterdam live on the line as well. Professor Zieck, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Professor Cho, perhaps we can start off with the definition of the key diction here. Under international law, what is the refugee concept?
Well, the traditional definition of a refugee under the 1951 Refugee Convention is somebody who is outside the country of their nationality and is unable to return to their country because of well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, their membership of a particular social group, or holding a certain political opinion. So you can see that this traditional definition under international law is actually quite narrow, and in some regions they have expanded the definition to include those people who are displaced because of internal conflict, foreign domination, or other serious disturbance to public order and so on. But again, people who are internally displaced within a country are not included in that definition, and also the so-called economic migrants, people who have had to flee their, or sort of who've left their country because they cannot no longer seek a livelihood within their own country, are also not included in that definition.
Right. And Professor Zieck, as we speak, what can you tell us about the assistance offered to refugees worldwide?
Well, as Professor Cho said, refugees are persons who have crossed an international border. And what they need first and foremost is protection, asylum in another state. About 75% of the states in the world, including the Republic of Korea, are party to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. The protection in those treaties consists first and foremost of protection against forced return to territories where the life or freedom of refugees may be threatened. In addition, those treaties lay down basic human rights, many of which are tailored to accommodate the special needs of refugees. Think, for instance, of the need for identity papers. States not parties to those instruments have comparable obligations by virtue of customary international law and human rights treaties to which they are a party. This does not, however, mean that all refugees are protected as indicated. Too many states intentionally flout their international obligations by closing borders or engaging in pushbacks, and other states simply do not have the capacity to provide the requisite protection on account of large numbers of refugees they are hosting.
Right. Now, Professor Cho, earlier you mentioned a number of factors that aggravate the displacement of people within their original territory. What would you choose to highlight, Professor Cho, as perhaps the main causes of the surge in refugees in recent years then?
Yes, we actually have seen an increase. I believe last year the number of refugees has hit a record historically, coming to something like 8.8 million people worldwide just in 2023 alone. And one obvious reason is the war in Ukraine, which has produced so far around 6.5 million refugees since the start of war in 2022. Apart from that, there is the more recent conflict in Gaza, which has produced around 1.8 million refugees. The Sudanese civil war that has produced around 1.7, I believe. million refugees or internally displaced people also, and the ongoing chaos in Myanmar since the retaking of the government by the military and the civil strife that's occurring there has produced some 1.2 million refugees there, and the continuing instability in Afghanistan is also a contributing factor. And these are just a few of the major ones, and there are obviously other smaller events that are contributing to this great surge in refugee numbers around the world.
Right, and against the backdrop of these staggering, very shocking numbers, Professor Zieck, there has been quite a bit of media coverage about the EU's pact on migration and asylum. Could you tell us a bit about this pact and its implications?
Well, the pact consists of a package of regulations and directives which will be developed shortly. And they address securing basically the EU external borders by means of a system to manage arrivals at those borders by preventing unauthorized movements, by strengthening decision-making process on asylum applications, by expediting return procedures, etc. Based on the pact, to elaborate a bit more, asylum seekers will be differentiated between those who are likely to be granted asylum and those who are not, such as refugees who originate from so-called safe third countries and those who are traveling on forced or with forced documents. They will be kept in closed reception centers at the external borders of the European Union and will be accelerated to an accelerated border procedure. And in case their application is rejected, they will also be subjected to speedy return. As to those who are not subjected to the accelerated procedure, the European Union state where the asylum seeker arrives is usually, and that has been practiced so far, is usually responsible for processing the claim of the asylum seekers. And that results in gross inequalities, gross imbalances in responsibility between those EU states. Under the pact, those imbalances will be offset by means of a mandatory solidarity mechanism. Other states, so not the frontline states, may opt to provide either funding to those states that host most of the refugees or relocate and host asylum seekers in their stead. I would like to add that the new pact is cause for concern, in particular the screening procedure at the border that aims to separate promising and not promising asylum seekers, the detention of asylum seekers, the fiction that those centers at the external borders of the European Union are not European territory, with the implication that some specific international obligations would not be applicable there, such as human rights obligations. There's also the possibility that all asylum seekers, including the promising ones, will also be kept in those centers whenever the Commission will proclaim there is an emergency. And another worrying aspect, I would say, is that part of the pact is also intensifying the drive to keep refugees away from Europe by means of anti-migration deals with countries of origin and transit countries in North Africa. All this while Europe is not the continent or the area receiving most of the world's refugees. So I'm worried about it. What example do we set, and how can we expect that other states elsewhere who do host most of the world's refugees will live up to their obligations?
Right. And your concerns also appear to be a political hot potato in the Netherlands as well. I mean, last year the Dutch government collapsed following failure to seal a deal on curbing immigration. How do you explain this unfortunate phenomenon, and what can you tell us about the country's current policy?
Right. Well, to start with the first part of your question, the coalition partners could not reach agreement about the demand of the Liberal Party that family reunification for recognized refugees in the country should be made impossible. One of the parties, the Christian Union, considered this unacceptable, and that was the end of the government. But since family reunification cannot be abolished in the way it was suggested, simply because it would breach the human right to family life, this collapse was not necessary and presumably induced by other motives, possibly the perception on the part of the Liberal Party that it would thus incur favor with right-wing voters in new elections. So we had those elections last year, and right-wing voters did vote, and they did win, but not so much by voting for the Liberal Party, but for the extreme right-wing Freedom Party. I just saw the photograph of Wilders, who is chairing that party. So we do not now at the moment have a new government, but we will shortly have a coalition government of 4 right-wing parties. They recently outlined their government plan for the coming 4 years. With respect to refugees, the plan intends to realize a very strict admission regime, and the intention is to render the Netherlands unattractive to asylum seekers. And let me give a few examples of the measures which the plan enumerates. First of all is the possibility to block processing asylum claims. The other measure is to ensure that the admissions percentage is brought under the European average by means of, for instance, reversing the burden of proof in asylum procedures, by reducing legal aid, by adjustment of safe country criteria, by curbing appeals. Another measure which is put forward in the plan is abolishing the priority which is currently given to recognized refugees with respect to the allocation of housing, the abolishment of their current right to an indefinite stay in the Netherlands, and altogether another measure is to submit an opt-out clause with respect to European asylum and migration law, modernizing the 51 Convention, whatever that may mean, and regarding the EU pact, which I mentioned earlier, to buy out rather than receive refugees. While some of those measures probably can be realized, international law will stand in the way of many others. The Netherlands is fortunately bound to observe international and European refugee and asylum law, customary international law, and human rights law.
Right. Meanwhile, back here in this part of the world, Professor Cho, neighbouring Japan has also been facing quite a bit of criticism over tougher asylum deportation rules. What more can you tell us?
Well, Japan, alongside Korea, has actually been notorious for its rather stingy acceptance rate of refugees. But last year, they actually accepted a record number of refugees, all 303 of them, mostly from Afghanistan. But right after that, they actually changed their immigration law so that it will be much more difficult now for asylum seekers to appeal decisions that reject their applications. So up until now, asylum seekers, according to international legal principles, were able to stay in the country, so within Japan, while their refugee applications were being processed. And if they got rejected, they could appeal the decision a limitless number of times. But now they've changed the law so that the appeal is limited to 3 times only. And once the application has been rejected for the 3rd time, then the government can deport them out of the country, and they no longer have a right of appeal. The Japanese government argue that this is to ensure that there is, it curtails the unnecessary lengthy stay in these deportation centers, and also to weed out those who are essentially faking their applications and are unable to support their claims through proper evidence. But it's actually very difficult for asylum seekers while they're fleeing the country in chaotic conditions to get all the official records together, and they have to do their best to try to get documentation once they're in a position to make the claims. But obviously this is a calculated policy on part of Japanese government because they've decided that it's not tenable to give this unlimited opportunity to appeal the rejection decisions.
Right. Also over in the U.S., Professor Zieck, the Biden administration has taken executive action to drastically, that is, tighten the country's southern border. How do you explain this measure, Professor Zieck?
Well, first of all, what led to this action? I think President Biden said that congressional Republicans had left him with no choice after they had blocked a bipartisan border security bill earlier this year. And the question then is, was it then inevitable? And I think no, because the order clearly is unlawful. The order suspends entry of those who cross the US-Mexico border into the United States unlawfully when that border is overwhelmed. It means that asylum claims are not taken into consideration when the 7-day average for daily crossings hits 2,500 persons. The order will then be lifted when fewer than 1,500 people a day on average cross the border in a time span of a week. I think the order is unlawful for the following reasons. First of all, the 1967 protocol to which the United States is a party does not allow derogation at all. Second, unlawful entry is not a valid excuse. Article 31 of the Convention, which is applicable to the United States by virtue of the 1967 protocol, Article 31 makes it clear that unlawful entry may not be penalized. And I think I really like Article 31. And the drafters understood very well that lawful entry is rarely an option. So unlawful entry may not be penalized. I also would say the order violates Article 33, paragraph 1, which is the prohibition on forced return, which I mentioned earlier, and which extends to a rejection of refugees at the border. The claim that the United States claimed that the admission is detrimental to U.S. interests, which is the legal basis of the order, is not a valid excuse either. The international obligations of the United States include verifying whether there are serious reasons for considering that individual refugees, so not groups, have committed a war crime, a crime against peace, a crime against humanity, or a serious non-political crime. So the United States can and must meet its concerns in an alternative manner.
Right. Professor Cho, meanwhile, here in Korea, a local court granted the country's first refugee status, I believe, to a Russian draft dodger amid the war in Ukraine. What would you say is the significance of this latest ruling?
Well, the fact that this is a first court decision that recognized the conscientious objector status of a Russian asylum seeker is significant, because I mentioned Ukrainian war as one of the causes that led to the surge or increase in refugee numbers in recent years. And apart from 6.5 million Ukrainian refugees, there is also an untold number of Russian refugees, and actually 5,000 of them have ended up here in Korea last year, and that represents around 30% of total number of asylum seekers who have made applications in Korea last year. And this case that was heard by the Seoul Administrative Court, essentially the court was convinced by the evidence presented by the Russian claimant, the asylum seeker, that he is not only a conscientious objector and therefore refused to serve in the military in Russia, which means, I understand, up to 10 years imprisonment, but also he is a supporter of the late Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, and he has made statements supporting Navalny on various social media platforms, and so he had the genuine fear of persecution and most likely punishment if he returned to Russia. Now, as to whether this decision will lead to more lenient assessment of other applications by Russian refugees, in particular of that group, I don't think that's the case. And even in this particular case, my understanding is that the Ministry of Justice has appealed the decision. So we may actually have to wait for the decision of the appeal court. And so we are still very not very generous when it comes to recognizing asylum claims. Out of 18,000 asylum applications last year, I believe some 147 cases were accepted, which represents less than 1%. I mentioned the stinginess of Japan when it comes to asylum seekers, and their record is at least 3.5%, which is actually somewhat better than ours. And so this one case alone, I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference. But given the fact that asylum seekers usually end up in neighboring countries, it's no wonder that we are getting Russian refugee applicants in the record numbers as it's happening. And it's likely, if the war in Ukraine continues, we'll actually see an increase in that number.
Right, but hopefully I'm sure you'll agree with me when I said hopefully that the war in Ukraine will end in the near future. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Professor Cho, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Zieck over in Amsterdam, thank you very much for your insights.
You're welcome.
Right, many advocates claim or point out everyone has a right to seek safety, and those already in safety should seek to do what they can to share their shelter, be it literally or metaphorically. Thank you for watching.